I learned to trust my hunger before I trusted my courage. Courage was a memory, a phantom warmth from a life stolen by frost and steel. Hunger, though, was real. It was a constant, hollow ache in the pit of my soul, a chilling whisper that demanded suffering to be silenced. My service to the Ebon Blade was not a quest for redemption. It was a leash, a way to point that hunger at the deserving, lest it turn inward and consume the ashes of what I once was. My post was a lonely watchtower on the edge of the Dragonblight, a spire of black stone that clawed at a sky perpetually bruised with shades of gray and violet. Here, the only sound was the wind, a mournful dirge that scoured the ice and carried the ghosts of 1,000 battles. My days, if they could be called that in this land of endless twilight, were governed by a Spartan routine. I would rise from my cot, not from the call of sleep's end, but from a simple cessation of stillness. Sleep was a luxury for the living, a state I could no longer achieve. Instead, I entered a torpor, a silent state where memories, sharp and cruel as obsidian shards, would surface from the frozen depths of my mind. I saw a sun-drenched courtyard in Lordaeron, felt the weight of a different kind of armor, one polished to a silver gleam, not forged from the blood of tortured souls. I heard a woman's laugh, light and free, a sound that now felt like a physical blow. I would wake from these reveries with the phantom taste of bread and wine on my tongue, a cruel jest that only deepened the gnawing void within. The first ritual of the day was to tend to my armor. Serenite, the blood of an old god, they whispered, cooled and forged into an unbreakable cage. It was less a suit of protection and more a mobile tomb, each plate heavy with the echoes of despair. I would run a whetstone over the filigreed skulls and spikes, not to sharpen them, but to feel the vibration, the cold, dead resonance that matched my own. The metal was always cold, a deep, penetrating chill that seeped through my gauntlets and into my lifeless bones. It was a cold that the living could never comprehend. It was not the absence of heat, but a presence of its own, an active, malevolent force that clung to everything in this forsaken continent. My blade came next. Soul Reaper, a name I had not chosen, but one that had been branded upon it, and by extension, upon me. It was a monstrous thing of dark steel and shimmering, malevolent runes that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. The runes were hungry, too. They drank the ambient misery from the air, and in battle, they drank life itself. Sharpening, it was a meditative act. The scrape of the runic forged stone against the edge was a rhythmic, predictable sound in a world of chaos. As I worked, I would feel the weapon's faint thrum of anticipation, a resonance that traveled up my arms and settled in my chest, a cold fire that mimicked a heartbeat. It was the closest I ever came to feeling alive. After the gear, there was the ghoul. I called him Patch, a crude name for a crude creature, stitched together from the parts of fallen soldiers. He was not a companion. He was a tool, a reservoir of necrotic energy I could draw upon, a hound I could unleash. He would shamble at the base of the tower, his jaw slack, his movements clumsy yet unnerving. He never made a sound beyond a low, wet gurgle. I would toss him a chunk of frozen mammoth meat, not out of kindness, but to maintain his form. He would devour it with a sickening series of snaps and tears, his vacant eyes fixed on nothing. Watching him, I often wondered how much of the man he was made from remained trapped within that grotesque shell. It was a question I did not want answered. The final part of my mourning was the scourging, not of the land, but of myself. The Lich King's will was broken, they said. We were free. But his voice was not the only chain that had bound us. There was the hunger, a constant, predatory need to inflict pain. To leave it untended was to let it fester, to let it drive you to madness and cruelty against the undeserving. So, I would descend to the crypts beneath the tower, where captured Scourge abominations were chained to the walls. These were mindless things, animated only by the lingering magic of the fallen king. I would draw my blade, and I would cause them pain, not with the quick, clean efficiency of a kill, but with a slow, deliberate series of cuts and necrotic pulses. Each cry of agony from the creature, Each sizzle of unholy energy was a balm to the gnawing in my soul. It quieted the whispers. It sated the void for a time. It was a monstrous act, a necessary evil. This was the price of my control, the grim sacrament of my continued existence. My patrols were silent, lonely affairs. I would mount my death charger, Ruin, a skeletal steed whose eyes burned with the same cold, blue fire that flickered in my own. His hooves, shod in enchanted ice, made no sound on the packed snow. We would ride for hours, a solitary, ghostly figure moving through a dead landscape. The Dragonblight was a graveyard of giants. The colossal bones of dragons, ancient and vast, littered the plains, half buried in the snow like the ribs of forgotten gods. The air here was thick with history and sorrow. You could feel the echoes of the final, desperate moments of those magnificent creatures, a psychic residue of pain that clung to the very ice. It was a fitting place for one such as me. I patrolled the edges of the Path of the Titans, a massive, frozen road built by beings beyond mortal comprehension. Here, the wind howled with a particular ferocity, and the shadows seemed to writhe with unseen things. I was not looking for Scourge stragglers, not really. They were a nuisance, but no longer a coordinated threat. My task was to watch, to be a sentinel against anything that might seek to reclaim the Lich King's power, to harness the plague, or to disturb the restless dead. It was a vigil with no foreseeable end. I was a scarecrow in a field of bones, a warning made of dead flesh and dark magic. Sometimes, in the deep cold of the wastes, another memory would break through. Not of Lord Darren, but of this place. A memory from my time as a slave to the Scourge. I saw myself at the head of a deathless platoon, my blade glowing with a terrifying light, my commands echoing with the hollow authority of the Lich King's voice. I remembered the slaughter at Angrathar the Wrathgate, the sheer, unthinking ecstasy of destruction. I remembered the faces of the Alliance soldiers, their eyes wide with terror as I cut them down. I remembered the smell of their blood, hot and steaming in the frigid air. These were not phantom pains. They were stains on my soul that would never wash away. They were the truth of what I had become. On one such patrol, I found something that was not a memory. It was a corpse, half frozen in the snow near the base of a dragon's skull. This was not unusual, but the manner of its death was. The man was a human, a prospector by the looks of his gear. He was not torn apart by ghouls or pierced by a scourge blade. He was drained. His skin was gray and desiccated, clinging to his bones like old parchment. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream, but there was not a single drop of blood on him or the snow around him. I knelt, my gauntlet resting on his frozen chest. A faint, unfamiliar necrotic signature lingered, twisted and amateurish, but undeniably present. It was not the clean, cold power of the Scourge. It was something else, something living. I followed the tracks. They were faint, covered by the recent snowfall, but my unliving eyes saw things the living could not. The subtle disturbance of energy, the lingering scent of fear and exertion. The trail led me away from the Path of the Titans and toward a series of rocky, windswept hills that bordered the Crystal Song Forest. It was a desolate region, avoided by the living and holding little interest for the Scourge. The track belonged to several individuals, shod in heavy boots, not the shambling gait of the undead. Mortals. They were clumsy, leaving behind discarded food rations and the occasional drop tool. They were trying to be discreet, but they were amateurs. As dusk settled, casting long, distorted shadows from the dragon bones, I saw a flicker of light in the distance. A campfire. I dismounted from Ruin, ordering him to wait with a silent command. The massive warhorse blended into the shadows, his cold fire eyes the only sign of his presence. I moved forward on foot, my plate armor making no sound, a privilege of the enchantments woven into it. I was a wraith of metal and memory, gliding over the snow. The camp was nestled in a small ravine, sheltered from the wind. There were 3 of them, mortals huddled around a fire, their faces gaunt and their eyes filled with a feverish light. They wore the ragged robes of scavengers, but their conversation was not of salvage. "The vessel is almost ready," one of them hissed, his voice a dry whisper. "The ritual requires more essence." The last one was barely enough. Another one, a woman with matted hair and a tattoo of a coiled serpent on her cheek, nodded. "The patrols are getting bolder." One of the Lich King's puppets was seen near the prospector's claim. "We must be quicker." The third man, larger and more brutish, simply grunted and poked the fire with a shard of bone. They were cultists, fools dabbling in powers they could not possibly comprehend. Necromancy was not a tool for the impatient or the greedy. It was a force of nature like a glacier or a plague, and it would consume them. I watched them for an hour, my body perfectly still, my breath a non-existent mist. They spoke of a master who had promised them power, eternal life in exchange for their service. They were preparing a ritual to reanimate a powerful corpse they had unearthed to create a servant of their own. Their ignorance was astounding. They thought they could control the forces of death, command the will of the grave. They were like children playing with a loaded crossbow. I could have ended them then and there. 3 quick strikes, 3 silent deaths. My blade hungered for it, but their talk of a master of a larger plan stayed my hand. This was not just a trio of deluded scavengers. It was a symptom of a larger disease. This was the moment the quiet routine was broken. This was the catalyst. It was not a grand summons from a High Lord, not a blaring war horn. It was the hushed, idiotic whispers of mortals meddling with my domain. Death was my charge now. It was the one thing I understood with perfect clarity. These people were defiling it, twisting it with their petty ambitions. They were an infection, and I was the cure. My vigil had found its purpose. I was no longer a scarecrow. I was a reaper, and a harvest was due. The summons came not from High Lord Mograine, but from the land itself. A desecration that demanded a response. Yet protocol was protocol. I returned to my tower, the cultist's words echoing in the silent chambers of my mind. I stood before the scrying basin, a pool of black water infused with shadows and echoes. Pouring a drop of my own stagnant blood into the water, I watched as the surface swirled and solidified, forming the grim, spectral visage of Darien Mograine, High Lord of the Ebon Blade. His face, eternally stern, regarded me from within the depths. There was no greeting, no preamble. Our kind had little use for such pleasantries. "Report, Night Warden Kalen." His voice resonated, not through the air, but directly in my thoughts, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. I recounted what I had seen and heard. The drained prospector, the tracks, the cultists, their talk of a master and a ritual. I was concise, my words stripped of emotion, a simple recitation of facts. Mograine listened in silence, his spectral eyes unblinking. The ebon blade was stretched thin, our forces standing guard across this frozen hell and beyond, ensuring the Scourge remained a scattered, mindless threat. A new player on the board, especially one using necromancy, was a complication we could not afford. "This master is unknown to us." Mograine's voice returned after a moment of consideration. "The timing is suspicious. With the fall of the Lich King, a power vacuum was inevitable. Many would seek to fill it." His words confirmed my own thoughts. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the nature of magic, especially dark magic, is no different. Your vigil is now an investigation. Find this master. Uncover their purpose. Eradicate this cult. The command was absolute. There was no discussion of strategy, no offering of reinforcements. I was the instrument of the Ebon Blade in this sector. I was expected to be sufficient. "It will be done, High Lord," I replied, the words feeling strange and formal in my own mind. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Do not underestimate them, Kalen. The desperate are often the most dangerous. They wield power without discipline, and that makes them unpredictable. Show them the folly of their ambition." The connection severed, and his face dissolved back into the inky blackness of the scrying pool. The order was given. My oath, sworn in the shadow of Icecrown itself, was invoked. We, the Knights of the Ebon Blade, were the jailers of the damned. We were the ones who would stand against the horrors we once served, ensuring no one else would ever wield that power again. Before I departed, I performed the ritual of the blade. In the heart of the tower's crypt, I knelt before a small, unadorned altar of black stone. I laid Soul Reaper upon it, its runes pulsing faintly in the gloom. I placed my hands over the hilt, closing my eyes, not to pray, but to commune. The light had long abandoned me, but power remained. I focused on the cold within me, the unholy energy that animated my dead limbs, and channeled it into the blade. The runes flared, from a dull viridian to a brilliant, terrifying emerald. A low hum filled the chamber, a sound of immense power barely held in check. I whispered the words of the oath, not to any god, but to the weapon itself. In death, we serve. In darkness, we find purpose. Let no soul defy the grave. Let no master rise from the ashes of the Scourge. The words were a promise. A vow to my blade, to my order, and to the remnants of the man I used to be. The blade grew cold, absorbing the energy, its hunger momentarily sated by my devotion. I sheathed it, the sound of steel on scabbard echoing like a final closing of a tomb door. My march began under the melancholic gaze of a fractured moon. The dragonblight was a different creature at night. The great bones of the dragons seemed to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light, and the wind carried whispers that were not just the product of a troubled mind. I did not ride ruin this time. A war horse, even a skeletal one, was too conspicuous. I moved on foot, a solitary shadow against the endless snow. My stride was tireless, a dead man's pace that could be maintained for days without rest. The cold was my ally, masking my presence, muffling my steps. I was a part of the landscape, another piece of the unending, frozen death that defined this land. I returned to the ravine where I had seen the cultists. The camp was abandoned. The fire was a circle of black ash, and all that remained were a few discarded scraps of leather and bone. They had moved on deeper into the hills. Their tracks were fresh, their haste evident in the chaotic mess they left behind. They were moving toward a specific location, a place of power they believed would be the crucible of their ascension. Following them was a simple matter. They were like frightened animals, leaving a trail of refuse and fear in their wake. Their desperation was a scent I could almost taste on the air. The path led me to the ruins of a small Tusker village, long since abandoned. The Scourge had swept through here during the war, and all that was left were the skeletal remains of their huts, the whalebone structures stark against the snow. But something was wrong. A new structure stood in the center of the ruins, a crude chapel built from driftwood, jagged stones, and frozen mud. A sickly green light emanated from the cracks in its walls, pulsing in time with a low, guttural chanting that vibrated through the ground. This was their sanctuary. This was where they would perform their ritual. I found a vantage point on a nearby ridge, concealing myself behind a snowdrift. There were more of them now, perhaps a dozen cultists, all clad in the same ragged robes. They patrolled the perimeter of the ruins, armed with crude weapons, sharpened bones, rusted mining picks. Their movements were jerky, their eyes wide with a mixture of zeal and paranoia. They were guarding something within that profane chapel. I watched them for hours, learning their patrol routes, their numbers, the rhythm of their guard changes. They were sloppy, undisciplined. Their faith was their only armor, and I intended to shatter it. My first clash was not with a man, but with their sentries. They had tamed several feral ghouls, wretched things that loped around the ruins, sniffing the air. They were less disciplined than the Scourge's minions, driven by raw hunger. One of them caught my scent, the faint, cloying odor of the grave that clung to me. It let out a piercing shriek and charged, its claws extended. I did not move from my hiding place. I simply extended a hand, and a chain of pure ice shot from my palm, wrapping around the creature's leg. With a flick of my wrist, I yanked it off its feet and dragged it silently into the snowdrift with me. Before it could make another sound, I plunged a dagger of solidified shadow into its skull. It convulsed once and then was still. A silent, efficient kill. The hunger stirred within me, pleased with the small offering. I dealt with the other ghoul hounds in a similar fashion, using the shadows and the terrain to my advantage, pulling them into the darkness one by one. I was a predator in my natural element. The cold, the dark, the silence, they were my allies. The living feared these things, but I was born of them. With their beasts dispatched, the mortal sentries were blind. I began to move among the ruins, a ghost of vengeance. I stalked the first patrol from behind, my steps perfectly synchronized with the howling wind. He never knew I was there. My hand, encased in frozen steel, clamped over his mouth while Soul Reaper slid between his ribs. I felt the jolt as his life was extinguished, a brief flicker of warmth that my blade greedily drank. I lowered his body gently to the ground, leaving it in the shadow of a whalebone arch. One by one, I dismantled their perimeter. I used strangulating shadows to pull a sentry from his post, a localized blizzard to mask my approach on another. Each kill was silent, brutal, and impersonal. These were not warriors. They were fools, and they were dying for their foolishness. There was no honor in this, no grand battle. It was an extermination. The cold logic of my purpose was absolute. They were a blight, and I was the blade that would purge it. As I moved closer to the makeshift chapel, the chanting grew louder, more frantic. They were beginning the ritual. Time was running out. I reached the entrance of the chapel, a crude door made of splintered planks. 2 more cultists stood guard, their faces illuminated by the green light spilling from within. They held spears tipped with sharpened dragon bone, their knuckles white. They were terrified, not of an attacker, but of the power they were trying to invoke. I could feel the raw, chaotic energy pouring from the building, a storm of necrotic magic that prickled at my senses. They were channeling something far beyond their control. This had to end now. I did not use stealth this time. I stepped out of the shadows and into the faint light, my full, menacing height casting a long shadow before me. Soul Reaper was in my hand, its runes glowing with a predatory light. The 2 guards gasped, their eyes widening in terror. For a moment, they were frozen, paralyzed by the sight of a figure they had only heard of in hushed, fearful whispers. A death knight, a monster from their nightmares, made real. One of them found his voice, a high-pitched scream of alarm, as he thrust his spear at me. I swatted it aside with my gauntlet, the wooden shaft splintering on impact. I stepped forward, and with a single horizontal slash of my rune blade, I ended both their lives. Their bodies fell, and the chapel door swung inward with a groan. The true threat was inside. The interior of the chapel was a scene of pure madness. The air was thick with the stench of decay and burning, acrid incense. Green runes, crudely painted in what looked like blood, covered the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They pulsed with a sickening light, mirroring the frantic chanting of the 7 remaining cultists. They stood in a circle, their arms outstretched, their eyes rolled back in their heads. In the center of the circle, lying on a stone slab, was a corpse. But it was no ordinary corpse. It was the body of a Vrykul, one of the ancient half-giants who were the progenitors of humanity. It was immense, clad in rusted, archaic armor, a greatsword clutched in its dead hands. They were not just reanimating a body. They were trying to enslave a powerful, ancient spirit. At the head of the circle, leading the chant, stood a man in finer robes than the others. His face was hidden by a deep cowl, but his voice was clear, filled with a fanatical authority. This was the master. He was the source of the corruption. As I stepped into the room, the chanting faltered. The cultists turned, their ecstatic expressions turning to ones of horror. The master, however, did not flinch. He simply lowered his arms and turned to face me. "The Ebon Blade," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, almost academic. "I had anticipated your interference. You are a relic, a failed experiment. You seek to hoard death, to keep it locked away. I seek to share its gifts." He pulled back his cowl, and for the first time in my unlife, I felt something akin to shock. The face beneath the hood was one I knew. It was paler, thinner, etched with lines of cruelty and madness I did not recognize. But it was him, Lord Commander Valerius, a fellow knight of the Silver Hand, a man I had fought alongside in the campaigns against the orcs, a man I had believed died at the culling of Stratholme. I had seen him fall, overwhelmed by ghouls. His survival was impossible. Valerius? The name escaped my lips, a dry, cracked whisper. It felt alien on my tongue. He smiled, a twisted, joyless expression. That name died in the flames of Stratholme, Kaelin. I am Ethelred now, the opener of the way. While you were raised as a mindless puppet, I was granted true vision. I saw the weakness of the light, the frailty of life. I hid among the dead. I learned from the Scourge's masters, not as a slave, but as a student. The Lich King was a flawed vessel, too concerned with conquest. The true power of necromancy is not in creating armies, but in perfecting life itself, in transcending it. He gestured to the Vrykul on the altar. This is the first step, a vessel of ancient power bound to my will. With him, I will carve out a new kingdom, one where death is not an end, but a glorious beginning. This was the true threat, not just a band of cultists, but a fallen paladin, a man who had twisted his knowledge and his faith into a grotesque new philosophy. He had seen the same horrors I had, but where I had been broken and enslaved, he had embraced the darkness willingly. He was not just a necromancer. He was an apostate, a heretic to the very concept of life and death that I was now sworn to protect. The revelation was a cold weight in my chest. This was not just a mission anymore. It was personal. Valerius, or Ethelred, represented a path I could have taken, a descent into madness I had narrowly avoided. "You are a fool, Valerius," I said, my voice finding its strength, cold and hard as the iron of my armor. "You have learned nothing. You trade one master for another, the Lich King for your own ambition. It will consume you all the same." He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Look at you, Kaelin, the self-righteous corpse, chained to a new set of masters, pretending it is honor. You are a weapon that thinks it has a will of its own. I am a king." He raised his hand, and the cultists, their fear momentarily forgotten in their master's presence, drew their weapons. "No," Ethelred said, holding up a hand to stop them. "He is mine, an old debt to be settled." The choice was clear. There was no room for negotiation, no hope of redemption for him. He was a cancer that had taken root in the heart of this frozen land, and he had to be cut out. My duty to the ebon blade and the faint, lingering echoes of my old oaths as a paladin were in perfect, grim alignment. I had to protect the world from men like him. I had to protect the memory of the man he once was from a monster he had become. The mission was no longer about containment. It was about purification. I raised Soul Reaper, its green light casting my face in a ghastly glow. "The Silver Hand is dead, Valerius, and I will send you to join it." Our vows were reaffirmed in that profane space, not as brothers in the light, but as enemies in the dark. He drew a wicked-looking, sacrificial dagger, its blade humming with stolen life force. The air crackled with power, the chaotic energy of the half-finished ritual swirling around us. Fear was a distant memory, replaced now by a cold, burning fire. It was the fire of purpose. The fear belonged to the cultists huddled against the walls, watching as two ghosts from a fallen kingdom prepared to wage their final, terrible war. The ordeal began not with a clash of steel, but with a surge of profane energy. Ethelred, the man who was once Valerius, thrust his ritual dagger towards the Vrykul on the altar. "Awaken, guardian! Serve your master!" he screamed, his voice cracking with exertion. The runes on the floor flared violently, and a torrent of green energy lanced from the cultists, converging on the ancient corpse. The Vrykul's massive chest shuddered. A low groan, like the grinding of tectonic plates, echoed through the chapel. Its eyes, vacant moments before, snapped open, burning with the same malevolent green light that filled the room. It was not a mindless undead. There was a flicker of ancient, hateful intelligence in its gaze. I could not allow the ritual to be completed. I charged forward, my heavy boots shaking the crude wooden floor. The cultists, seeing me move, broke their concentration and rushed to intercept me, their faces contorted in masks of fanaticism. They were clumsy, their attacks wild and uncoordinated. I moved through them like a reaper through wheat. A backhanded blow from my gauntlet crushed the throat of the first. Soul Reaper clove through the chest of a second, the runes on the blade flaring as they tasted life. A third tried to stab me with a sharpened bone, but the point shattered against my serenite plate. I grabbed him by the face, my grip like iron, and hurled him into two of his companions, sending them sprawling into the rune-covered walls where they screamed as the raw magic seared their flesh. Ethelred watched this carnage with a detached curiosity, as if observing a storm. "You are still a blunt instrument, Kaelin," he sneered. All strength, no finesse. As I cut down the last of his followers, he completed his own incantation. He pointed his dagger at me, and a bolt of pure shadow energy, blacker than the spaces between the stars, shot towards me. I raised my blade, deflecting the bolt with a shower of green and black sparks. The impact shuddered up my arm, a numbing cold that was different from the chill of undeath. It was the cold of the void. While I was occupied, the Vrykol warrior finally pushed itself off the stone slab. It stood to its full, terrifying height, easily twice my own, its rusted armor groaning in protest. It raised its colossal greatsword, a weapon that was larger than I was tall, and fixed its glowing eyes on me. The battle became a deadly dance. The Vrykol was immensely strong, each swing of its sword powerful enough to shatter stone. I could not meet its blows head-on. I was forced to dodge and weave, my unnatural speed and agility my only defense. The massive blade would crash down where I had been a second before, sending splinters of wood and chunks of frozen earth flying. While I evaded the hulking corpse, Ethelred assailed me from a distance, launching bolts of necrotic energy, summoning grasping skeletal hands from the floor, and chanting debilitating curses that sought to slow my limbs and dull my mind. It was a battle on two fronts, against raw physical power and insidious, corrupting magic. I focused on the Vrykol first. It was the greater immediate threat. As it swung its sword in a wide, horizontal arc, I slid underneath the blow, the wind of its passage stirring my cloak. I came up inside its guard and drove Soul Reaper deep into the giant's leg. The rune blade bit through ancient mail and dead flesh, and the Vrykol roared, a sound of fury and pain that shook the very foundations of the chapel. It tried to bring its pommel down on my head, but I was already moving, pulling my blade free and rolling away. A bolt of shadow from Ethelred scorched the spot where my head had been. I was a rat in a cage with two starting cats. The cost of this fight was not measured in fatigue. I felt none, but in the steady drain on my power. Each parry, each burst of speed, each counterspell I had to instinctively weave to ward off Ethelred's curses drew upon my finite pool of runic energy. The runes on my blade began to dim, their hunger growing. I needed to feed them. I needed to inflict a telling blow. I saw my opening when the Vrykol, enraged by the wound in its leg, abandoned all caution and charged, its greatsword raised for a killing blow. It was a foolish, predictable move. The warrior's spirit within the corpse was still a warrior, prone to rage. Instead of retreating, I stood my ground. I plunged my own blade, Soul Reaper, into the floorboards at my feet and focused my will. "Rise," I commanded, not with my voice, but with the full force of my necromantic power. The ground around the charging Vrykol erupted. The cultists I'd slain, their bodies still lying where they had fallen, were pulled back from the brink. Their limbs contorted, their spines snapped straight, and with empty sockets glowing with cold blue light, my own freshly made ghouls clawed their way to their feet. They were not strong, but they were a distraction. They threw themselves at the Vrykol's legs, clawing and biting, a swarm of vengeful corpses. The Vrykol bellowed in frustration, forced to stomp and kick at the ghouls swarming its feet. This was the moment I needed. With my newfound servants occupying the giant, I turned my attention to the true enemy. I drew Soul Reaper from the floor and charged at Ethelred. He was not a warrior. His surprise was evident on his face as I closed the distance in a few swift strides. He tried to conjure another spell, but he was too slow. I batted his dagger from his hand and slammed him against the chapel wall, my forearm pressed against his throat. "It's over, Valerius," I growled, the sound a low rasp of finality. He choked, a desperate, gurgling laugh escaping his lips. "You think you've won?" he gasped, his eyes wild with insane glee. "You only chose the manner of your own end." It was then I felt it. A searing, white-hot pain in my side. I looked down and saw the hilt of his sacrificial dagger protruding from a gap in my serenite plates. While I was focused on a Vrykul, he had summoned it back to his hand with a simple trick of telekinesis and plunged it into me as I charged. The blade was enchanted. It was not just steel that pierced me. It was concentrated, life-draining magic. It did not wound my body so much as my soul, a spiritual poison that began to unravel the very enchantments that held my unliving form together. My strength began to fail, the cold fire within me dimming. The assist came from an unexpected quarter. The Vrykul, having finally crushed the last of my makeshift ghouls, turned its attention back to me. It saw me falter, saw the dagger in my side, and it raised its great sword for the final, undeniable blow. I was too weak to move, the poison of Ethelred's dagger paralyzing me. This was it, a pathetic end at the hands of a madman and his puppet. But as the sword began its descent, one of my fallen ghouls, a creature I had raised only moments before and thought destroyed, gave one final, twitching lurch. It was not dead. With its last vestige of unholy animation, it reached up and latched its teeth onto the Vrykul's unarmored ankle. It was a meaningless attack, a flea biting a giant. But it was enough. The Vrykul's foot slipped on the icy floorboards, its balance thrown off for a fraction of a second. The greatsword, meant for my neck, went wide, burying itself deep in the wooden wall beside me. The Vrykul was overextended, its weapon stuck fast. In that instant, a flicker of my old strength returned, born of pure desperation. I ignored the screaming agony from the dagger in my side. I ignored Ethelred's triumphant laughter. I raised Soul Reaper with both hands, the runes flaring with a final, desperate burst of power, and I swung. The blade cut clean through the Vrykul's thick neck. The giant's head, its green eyes wide with surprise, toppled from its shoulders and rolled across the floor with a heavy thud. The massive body stood for a moment, headless, before crashing to the ground, shaking the entire chapel. Ethelred's laughter died in his throat. His ultimate weapon was destroyed. He stared at the fallen giant, then at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. With a surge of adrenaline I did not know I still possessed, I ripped his dagger from my side, a guttural roar of pain tearing from my lungs. The wound did not bleed, but a foul, black smoke poured from it, the smoke of my own dying energies. I stumbled forward, holding Soul Reaper before me. "You have failed," I rasped. He backed away, his academic calm shattered, revealing the terrified man beneath. He fumbled for another spell, another trick, but his concentration was broken. I lunged, and my rune blade, hungry for vengeance, hungry for release, plunged deep into his chest. His eyes went wide, not with pain, but with a final profound understanding. "The void's so cold," he whispered, and then the light faded from his eyes, and the man who was once Valerius fell, truly and finally dead. The ordeal was over. The silence that descended upon the chapel was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than the quiet of the frozen wastes. It was the silence of a tomb, filled with the dead and the dying. The sickly green light from the runes on the walls flickered and died, their power source, Ethelred, extinguished. I stood there for a long time, leaning on my blade for support, the black smoke still coiling from the wound in my side. The room was a charnel house, littered with the bodies of the cultists, the headless corpse of the Vrykul, and the still form of the man I once called brother. I was the last thing standing. Victory felt no different from defeat. It was just quiet. My first task was to consolidate. The wound from Ethelred's dagger was grievous. It was a spiritual injury, a severing of the bonds that held me together. I could feel my essence leaking away, a slow, cold drain that threatened to unravel me completely. I knelt, my movements stiff and agonizing, and placed my hand over the wound. I focused on the cold within, the core of my unholy power, and drew it towards the injury. I began to weave a seal, not of flesh, but of ice and shadow. Frost crystallized over the wound, forming a dark, glittering patch that staunched the flow of energy. It was a temporary measure, a crude patch that would hold until I could return to Akiris for proper repairs of the Runeforge. The pain did not subside, but the feeling of dissolution did. Next, I tended to the fallen, not with honor or ceremony, but with grim necessity. The bodies of the cultists could not be left to rot. In this land, a corpse was simply a vessel waiting for a new, malevolent occupant. One by one, I dragged them outside and piled them onto the remains of their blasphemous altar. I used a simple cantrip of frostfire, a cold, blue flame that consumed flesh and bone with equal efficiency, leaving nothing behind but scorched stone and a thin layer of gray ash that the wind quickly scattered. It was a clean, sanitary process, devoid of ritual. A problem had been solved. The Vrykul was another matter. Its body was too large to burn easily, and its spirit, though now without a master, might still linger. I could not risk it being reanimated by some other scavenger of magic. I spent the next hour dismembering the corpse with my rune blade, a brutal, exhausting task in my weakened state. I separated limb from torso, scattering the pieces across the ruins, ensuring no single part of it could ever be used as a focus again. Its head, I crushed under my boot, the ancient bone turning to powder. It was a desecration, but a necessary one. I was not here to preserve history. I was here to bury it. Finally, there was Valerius. I stood over his body for a long time, the cold wind whipping my cloak around me. Part of me, a small, forgotten part that still remembered the sun, wanted to give him a paladin's farewell, a prayer to the light, a cairn of stones. But he had forsaken that right. He was Ethelred now, a necromancer and a madman. The light would not answer a prayer from my lips anyway. Instead, I simply took his body and placed it upon the pyre with his followers. As the frost fire consumed his robes and his pale flesh, I felt nothing. No sorrow, no satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness. The past was ash, and it was my duty to scatter it to the winds. With the ground secured and the bodies disposed of, it was time to report. I could not travel back to the tower in my condition. I opened a death gate, a swirling vortex of shadow and frost, its energies taxing my already depleted reserves. The air shimmered, and a portal to Akiris, the ebb and hold, tore open before me. The familiar sight of our dark citadel, floating in the sky above the Plaguelands, was a grim comfort. I stepped through, the transition jarring and cold. I found myself in the command center before the strategic map of Azeroth. Lord Thorval, one of Mograin's lieutenants, was on duty. He was a massive orc, his skin the color of slate, his tusks capped in steel. He looked up from the map as I emerged, his red eyes taking in my state, the frost-sealed wound, the exhaustion that even the dead can feel. Report, he grunted, his voice like rocks grinding together. I gave him the same account I had given Mograin, but with the grim conclusion. I told him of Valerius, of his identity, of his twisted philosophy, and of his end. I detailed the Vrykul, the ritual, and the cult's destruction. I left out the part about my own near demise, the moment of weakness. In the Ebon Blade, strength was the only currency that mattered. Weakness was a liability. Thorval listened without interruption. When I finished, he simply nodded. The threat is neutralized. The commander will be pleased. Your vigil was successful. He pointed a thick, clawed finger at my side. Go to the Runeforge. Have a soul binder tend to that. You're no use to us, broken. It was the closest thing to concern I could expect to receive, and I accepted it as such. There was no praise, no commendation. The mission was complete. That was all that mattered. The unknown remained. We still did not know if Valerius was truly the head of this snake, or if he answered to an even greater, unseen master. But for now, this particular infection was purged. I turned and walked towards the lower levels of Icarus, each step in agony, the silence of the hold a welcome shroud after the screams and chaos of the battle. The roar was over, and the quiet had returned. At the Runeforge, a goblin soulbinder with scorched eyebrows and a morbid fascination with Death Knight physiology tended to my wound. He muttered about unstable matrices and necrotic decay, his tools probing and stitching the spiritual tear in my being with threads of solidified shadow. The process was excruciating, a cold fire that felt like my very soul was being unmade and rewoven. But it worked. The leak of energy was sealed, the wound closed over not with a scar of flesh, but with a permanent tracery of faint, dark runes that would forever mark the spot where Valerius's ambition had struck me. I was whole again, if such a word could ever apply to me. In the days that followed, as I recovered my strength in the cold halls of Icarus, I had time to reflect. The confrontation with Valerius had taught me something vital. It was not enough to simply be a jailer of the Scourge. The legacy of the Lich King was not just an army of the dead. It was an idea of power through death, of order through domination. It was a seductive philosophy, and Valerius would not be the last fool to fall for its charms. The living, in their fear and greed, were just as dangerous as any mindless ghoul. They would always seek to harness what they did not understand, and in doing so, they would threaten to unleash it upon the world once more. I learned something about myself as well. In that final moment, facing the Vrykul, I had not felt the cold, calculated logic of the Ebon Blade. I had felt a flash of something older, the desperate instinct of a warrior to survive, the protective rage of a knight defending his charge, even if that charge was only his own cursed existence. The ghoul that had saved me, the one I had raised without a thought and considered utterly disposable, had shown more loyalty in its final twitch than Valerius had shown in his entire life. It was a humbling, disturbing thought. Perhaps there was more to my power than just cold domination. Perhaps there was a flicker of the old bonds, of loyalty and sacrifice, still buried deep beneath the ice. My understanding of the enemy had sharpened. They were not always monsters of rotting flesh and bone. Sometimes they wore familiar faces. They spoke with familiar voices. They were born not of plague, but of despair, ambition, and a twisting of faith. Valerius had been a good man once. I remembered him being the first to charge, the last to retreat. I remembered him sharing his rations with a hungry squire. The horror was not that he had become a monster, but that a hero had. It was a reminder of the thin line we all walk, and how easily it could be crossed. It solidified my resolve. My purpose was not just to fight monsters, but to ensure that no more were ever created. I returned to my lonely watchtower in the Dragonlight. It was unchanged. The wind still howled its mournful song. The great bones still littered the snow-swept plains. The sky was still a canvas of bruised purples and grays. My routine resumed. I tinted my armor. I sharpened my blade. I fed the ghoul. But something within me had shifted. The hollow ache was still there. The hunger still whispered. But now it was joined by something else. A clarity. A grim, unyielding sense of purpose that was wholly my own, not one given to me by Mograine or the Lich King before him. My oath was renewed, not in a grand ceremony, but in the silent stillness of my own dead heart. I was a warden. A sentinel at the edge of the world, watching over the greatest graveyard imaginable. My vow was to the memory of the fallen, both the innocent and the corrupted. I would stand guard over the ashes of the past to protect the future of a world I could no longer truly be a part of. I would be the monster that hunts other monsters. I would be the cold that drives out the dark. Tomorrow I march again. I looked out from the highest window of my tower, across the endless, frozen expanse of the Dragonblight. My blade, Soul Reaper, was strapped to my back, its runes pulsing with a faint, steady light. It was a cold and miserable existence, a life of endless winter and eternal vigilance. But it was my existence, and I would endure. For Lord Darren, for the fallen, for the ones who still had the warmth of life to lose. A whisper to the fallen, to Valerius, to the nameless prospector, and to the countless others. Rest now. I will keep the watch.